He also was involved in politics, garnered a lot of the new Russian votes, but again supported the right of centre parties rather than left of centre parties. In the first 15, 20 years, there were Russian parties, and they tended to support the right of centre. But unlike the Arab parties and unlike the Orthodox parties, it doesn't go from generation to generation. The next generation of Russians, if they can be called that, some of them don't want to be called that, my students, people who were 2 or 3 years old when they came in the 90s, or who have already been born to 2 Russian parents, but inside Israel, they already have grown up in a different way. They see themselves as Israelis. I see a lot of them in the halls like we're sitting in now as my students, and they want to be seen as Israelis. They grow up in Israeli schools. They don't go to separate Russian schools, such as a lot of the Arab and the Orthodox people go to. They serve in the army, and they see themselves as Israelis, and they're reflected across the spectrum, and they don't vote for Russian parties. So there was a period of 15 years where the Russian parties had a major influence. Today there is just one party left, which is the Lieberman party, and even that is far less based just on Russian votes than it was in the past. It's more of an extremist right-wing party. So you have all these nuances which tell you why you can't really transform the system, even if you do undergo electoral transformation, into a two-party system, because you have real sectoral interests. You can't come to the large Arab population of the country or the large Orthodox population of the country and say, we're going to create a system where unless you vote for the larger parties, you're not going to have any representation. That would be as undemocratic as, in other words, you would be excluding hundreds of thousands of people. Who knows, maybe 10, 20 years down the road under a two-party system, you would begin to see more Arab personalities or more Orthodox personalities being part of the major political party system. But it's unlikely because they have very strong and focused sectoral interests. So you have to understand that when you're creating political systems and electoral systems, you have to take into account what the ethnic composition of a country is about. You have to take into account that sometimes there are ethnic groups and differences which mean that you must have more than a two-party system. But there's no reason why all the Arab parties shouldn't run as a single Arab party, even though they have major internal differences. And there's no reason why the ultra-Orthodox parties shouldn't run as a single instead of 3 different parties, even though they will argue, and if you know the internal politics, you will say, they're so different from each other, their beliefs are so different, but the truth is their bigger beliefs are very much in common, and it's the minor things which are different. So there is a reason to come and argue and say, we need to raise the threshold a bit more to create a system where, yes, there will still be coalition governments, but there will be, let's say, 5 or 6 major parties in the Knesset instead of the 9 or 10 that we have today, or instead of the 14 or 15 that we used to have. So the point to make is that, of course, on the one hand, there is a certain system in operation. It's a very democratic system. As I say, it's the most proportional system in the world. Nearly everybody can say, I voted for a party which is represented in the Knesset. But on the other hand, it still has to work its way through this problem of stability and instability, and we're seeing the problems. It's very fun that Dr. Husky mentioned I write a column, a political column in the Jerusalem Post most weeks. And 3 weeks after the elections, I sat down and wrote a piece about electoral reform because I said, look, we're 3 weeks after the elections, we still haven't got a government together. Let's go back and talk about electoral reform. I had completely forgotten that 2.5 years ago, 3 weeks after the election, I wrote almost the same column. And I looked back and I saw I'd written almost the same thing. Well, that says 2 things. Number one, it says it's a very important issue on the agenda. Well, if I write it, it must be important. But it means that we haven't resolved that problem. And it's something that we have to come to terms with. So while you're looking at Israel, and obviously the bigger issues, which I haven't even discussed, I'm going to be talking about them later today when I talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict and borders and territories. And you're all very conscious of the conflict going on out there and the issues of Israel-American relations. You have to remember that a country has to run its own political system. It has to negotiate these issues through the way that the system is managed, and that's how we run politics in Israel. It's a very vibrant democracy. It's a fairly free democracy where anyone can say almost what they want about other parties, about other countries. I think that despite the problems of Israel-Arab relations, Jewish-Arab relations within Israel, the fact that we do have large Arab representation in the Knesset, and they can get up in the Knesset and say that we don't even support the principle of the Jewish state of Israel, which we are now in the Knesset for, in the context of conflict, I think that says a great deal for Israeli democracy, and it shouldn't be dismissed. It doesn't mean to say that everything is perfect. It doesn't mean to say that we don't need to make greater efforts to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but we have an extremely vibrant democracy, and I think it's something that we can be very proud of. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll take some questions, and we usually start with students. Yeah, Zoe.
If they were to have electoral reform, what would you propose that reform would?
Well, I've always been... Sorry?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the student asked if we were to have electoral reform, what is David Newman's proposal for electoral reform? In the past, I've always been a great supporter of constituencies, but I think that's because I grew up in the British system and I know what it's about. And there have been lots of simulations which have said, let's assume that Israel has a system where 60 of the members are on national lists and 60 are in constituencies. No one suggests it should be one-member constituencies, but let's say you had 20 regions with 3 members each, something like that. Let's feed the figures into it. Let's divide the country up into different types of areas, which of course is a very arbitrary thing, as you well know, that once you start dividing a country up into areas, the whole issue of gerrymandering takes a role, and who are the people who determine where the borders are drawn? Are they politicians? Are they judges? Are they neutral people? And of course it becomes a political issue in its own right. But these simulations have been played out in Israel, and there have been interesting results. There was a time in the 90s, the early 90s, when Herzog was president, and when the government had been brought down because of some sort of late-night deal between 2 factions, where there was huge demand for electoral reform, and Herzog as president tried to intervene, which the president normally doesn't. In our country, the prime minister is the powerful figure. The president is, in a sense, the queen-type figure, the constitutional figure. But at that time, Herzog tried to intervene and tell all the parties they need to have electoral reform, and a number of proposals were put on the table based around the idea, mixed system, 60 from the national list, 60 from the constituencies, and there was a bit of a discussion as to whether it should be 60 and 60 or 80 and 40, and there were variations on the theme. But interestingly, there was a counter discussion which said you don't need constituencies in Israel. And the argument that was used, and we've heard it a great deal, was Israel's such a small country. I know you think it's a huge country because of the amount of noise it makes in the international media, but it's a small country of 9 million people on 25,000 square kilometers. The whole area of Israel, including the occupied territories, is a third of Florida. And there was the argument that said the country's so small, everybody knows everybody. The prime minister or the leading ministers, 20 years ago, he was a major guy in the Israel military, say Ariel Sharon, for instance, or Ehud Barak, both of whom were very important military figures in the past. And you know what? His soldiers in the army was the guy who's now the mayor of Dimona and the mayor of Beersheba. So when they have a problem at the local level, they don't start looking for regional representation. They pick up the phone to the prime minister, Ehud Barak, who used to be their army commander, and say, Ehud, we've got a problem. You need to resolve it if you want my people to vote for you next time round. And there is that argument, which I wouldn't dismiss it entirely, which says that in small countries, that maybe a total regional representation isn't always best way, but of course it is important to have constituencies, not just because of the issue of stability. It's important to have constituencies to have regional representation, to have people whose interests are the region and the locale, rather than the national politics. When you only have national party lists, on the contrary, there have been people who have worked their way up into national party lists by being very successful mayors, and once they get into national party lists, they get up and leave and go and live in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem because the locale doesn't interest them anymore. So the importance of constituencies is about regional representation, and that doesn't necessarily contribute more or less to the issue of stability. I myself would like to see a mixed system in Israel, but I think it's too much of a revolution for Israeli politics. And I think what you're going to see, at least in the short term, is maybe simply the continuous raising each time by 0.5% or 1% of the lower threshold until you reach 5 or 6%, which at least will be significant, but in my view, not enough.
So compared to Great Britain's Prime Minister and the US as Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader, how much power in creating and sort of passing legislation does the Prime Minister of Israel have?
That's a very interesting. The stronger Prime Minister becomes, he has a lot. And Netanyahu is a very powerful figure today. He's won 4 elections. I think it's possible that after Ben Gurion, he's the longest serving Prime Minister in Israel. Was Shamir just as long? But he's slowly becoming, if he's not yet, he soon will be the longest serving Prime Minister in Israel, with the exception of David Ben Gurion himself. And therefore he has, now what was interesting in the past election was, if you were following the polls, it was very close, and the pollsters got it completely wrong this time. And they had the audacity afterwards to come and say, well, it was because of this, it's not because our methodology is wrong. It was because their methodology was totally out. They didn't realize what was going on. And yet they still are hired every time for the next elections. I never understand that one. One of the things that's happened to Netanyahu in the lead up to this last election, where he himself was very fearful, was that having been prime minister for so long, there was beginning to be dissatisfaction with him within his own party, which is why Kachalon got up and left. And people felt that there was a feeling in the street at a certain point of time that this was the end of Netanyahu, and that maybe even if, the right wing wouldn't get the votes they got because of Netanyahu, and it didn't work out that way. And for all sorts of reasons, you can analyze it, also in terms of Netanyahu's statements on election day itself. On election day itself, what happens is all the major politicians are filmed voting very early in the morning, and then they spend the day being interviewed and going around the country drumming up support. You can do that if you're, and again, as I say, it's such a small country, you can get from north to south, particularly if you've got a helicopter, within 2 hours, you can get virtually everywhere you want. He came out with a statement which afterwards by many was interpreted as having been a racist statement. He sort of came out and said, well, the information I'm getting in is that the Arabs are voting, all of them are voting. There's a very high Arab vote. And he left it at that. But what happened was they showed that after he made that statement about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a lot of right-wing voters who were dissatisfied with Netanyahu and had decided not to go and vote, decided, we're not going to let the Arab population determine who's going to be the next government, so they all went out and voted for Netanyahu. And this was afterwards criticized very strongly. Even the president, who is a right-wing politician, but who is very particular about ensuring that the rights of the Arab citizens of the country are maintained in every possible way as part of a democracy. There was tremendous criticism of Netanyahu, but I think that was a very powerful impact. And as it turned out, by the way, participation levels amongst the Arab population were not particularly higher than they were last time. Participation levels, by the way, in Israel have fallen over the last 15 years. Until about 20 years ago, we used to have the highest participation rates of any democracy which doesn't obligate its citizens to vote. We used to be up there in the 85 and 90%, and it's gone down over 15, 20 years. It even went down to below 70%, which is still high for the United States, but low for Israel. It kicked up a bit this last election to about 72, 73%, but many Israelis still see that as low. But nevertheless, and that was reflected throughout Israeli society. I think on the whole, when there are lower participation rates in Israel, it tends to impact the left more than it does the right.
How do they guarantee the participation of the Arabs, or like at least the opportunity for participation for like a lot of Palestinians in there? I mean, they're in these rough, almost like refugee-style camps in a lot of areas and whatnot.
Okay, I need to make a very important point here, and this is, of course, one of the big criticisms of Israel. When I talk about Arab/Palestinian participation, I refer to those who live within Israel, not over the Green Line, who do not have citizenship rights in Israel, which is I'm referring to about 20% of the Israeli population who are full citizens of Israel, and only that population. Israel does not grant citizenship to the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, on the argument that we haven't annexed that territory, but of course Israel doesn't want to do that because it doesn't want to create a situation where there will be parity between Arabs and Jews, and then it could lose its demographic majority, which is one of the reasons, by the way, and I'll talk about this later today, that is one of the major reasons why there was this move towards two-statism, even amongst right-wing politicians, because they realized that demography counts against Israel in the long term. But when it comes to national elections, it is only the Arab citizens of Israel who are entitled to vote.
Gotcha. So all the people in that region have no representation?
In the West Bank, no. In the Gaza Strip, no.
Wow, that's...
Yes, I agree with you.
Given the political ramifications and realities that you've talked about during this past hour, how are we closer or farther away to seeing a two-state solution or some sort of solution?
Come along at 4 o'clock and I'll talk about that, okay?
If I could sort of come back to that question, I think you answered most of it, but the part that I was really curious about is in the actual party, when they're actually passing policy, when they're actually writing up bills and passing them, can he control his coalition easily? Or?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, the idea is you want to control your coalition, but because you have so many different interests there, and of course there are a whole load of bargains that have to be made, and basically different parties are coming to him in the coalition agreement and saying, look, if you want us to support you on, let's say, something to do with economic legislation, then you're going to have to support our bill on educational legislation. So the whole building of the coalition is a series of trade-offs, not just between Netanyahu and the party, but it becomes much more complex towards the end, where it's trade-offs between 5 or 6 different parties. And each party has to feel, let's say, equally dissatisfied, but that it's got at least the minimum of what it wants in order to be part. And of course, parties want to be part of government rather than part of the opposition. There are cases. I mean, there's always the argument that says, well, because Israel's in the conflict and the 2 big parties are out there, we should have a government of national unity. The Likud and Labour together. And there were times in the 80s and 90s when there was nothing to choose between the 2 parties, and there were these cross political coalitions of the Labour and Likud party together, which never really went well together because they became governments of national paralysis, because each one always sort of froze out the other one. There were all sorts of agreements which meant you couldn't build settlements, but you also couldn't go towards a peace process. And even now there's been talk about Herzog being brought in for the sake of the national good, and it's a time of crisis, and there's the Iran missile threat, and therefore Herzog should really be part of a national unity government. But there are many people out there who say, no, that would be even a further death blow. The Labour Party has to be a powerful opposition, and it